The world has changed. I can feel it in the water. I can feel it in the earth. I can smell it in the air. Much that once was has been lost, because none now live that can remember. Except for us on the deep dive. Welcome! Woo-hoo!
What was that quote? Where's that quote from?
That quote's the first line from the Lord of the Rings movies.
Oh, that's the first line?
That's the first line. It's spoken by Galadriel in the movies. In the books, it was spoken by Treebeard later on. It wasn't the first lines in the book.
Well, excellent.
But in the movies, that's
well,
how
a fitting
starts.
intro then to the Tolkien episode.
Absolutely.
So, Colin, we talked with our guest Corey Olsen. Why don't you just give a little bio before we start the interview?
Absolutely.
Corey Olsen is.
As many people know, I'm a big geek, and
I do know that.
You do know
I
that,
do.
yeah.
That's apparent to all of us. Yep.
And Tolkien is my favorite author. As far as I'm concerned, it's like there's the Bible as the best book ever, and then anything Tolkien wrote.
High praise.
That's how it goes for me.
Okay.
So I've listened to lots of Tolkien podcasts, and his is one of my favorites, the Tolkien Professor. That's how I first heard about him.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave some lectures about explaining The Hobbit, and include some lectures about the Silmarillion and other books by Tolkien. That's how I first came across him. So Corey Olsen is a professor. He is served as a professor of English in several schools in the States. But right now he's doing something rather interesting, something called Signum Academy, Signum University,
mm-hmm.
which is like an online post-secondary school. They have a master's course in English and literature, but are creating more and more courses and more things. And this happened way before the pandemic. Nowadays we're all used to doing Zoom and conferences.
Yeah, since 2012, he was really ahead of the curve.
But yeah, he started it way back in 2012, and you can get a bunch of his lectures and classes on speculative fiction stuff, but especially Tolkien. And I've really loved his stuff. The way that he can bring out the meaning of Lewis and Tolkien.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just thought he would be the perfect guest for us to have, as we've been talking about how that idea of the truth of God coming through in myth and such.
Absolutely. And we got a podcast coming on Lewis, so we wanted to talk to this guy. He is not only a Tolkien expert, but really all of Middle English. He knows a lot about the Canterbury Tales and
that's
the
right. Like he can
Tour
speak in Old
Thomas
English,
Mallory.
and
so he's the real deal. And
yes.
he really thinks that Tolkien, like you just said, he believes Tolkien is one of the great writers of literature of all time. He believes he should be in that category. So we talked with him in this podcast about some of the Christian themes. It turns Corey Olsen is a Christian himself. Yeah. I mean, Tolkien's a wide enough kind of fan base, has a wide enough fan base that he doesn't always make it purely about that. But he enjoyed talking to us because it was this chance for him to kind of talk about some of the Christian themes or Catholic sort of motifs that you find in Tolkien.
Absolutely.
So we talked to him and unpacked that, and so here's our interview with Corey Olsen. Hope you enjoy.
Yeah. So thanks everyone for coming to be a part of our podcast for today. I'm Colin. This is my buddy Ben. Say hello to the people, Ben.
Hello. Good to see everybody.
We're super excited to bring this podcast to you because I have one of my geek mentors, although we've just met, but one of my geek mentors, Corey Olsen, is here with us. He's a professor in English literature, and he is the Tolkien Professor. Right, Corey? That's your main podcast that you got started with?
Yeah, that's right. Though I have gotten no limit of grief over the years about the definite article. There are several other Tolkien scholars who tease me about it every time I see them. They're like, "Oh, look, it's the Tolkien Professor," and
so
I'm like, And it was just a URL to start with. It was really just I didn't think it would catch on that way, but whatever.
Yeah, you know something, Professor Olsen, I wanted to ask you that right off the bat, because that must be a pretty sought after title. I mean, the Professor of Tolkien. I mean, is this a competitive arena that you're in, or what? There must be quite a few people.
Yeah, I mean, there are. Again, that's why, some of them are, and they're all very polite about it. They understand about the need for online branding. But no, originally it was not really a design on my part to claim some kind of seat of preeminence. Like, that wasn't what I had in mind. It was just, I was like, well, I'm going to do a podcast. It's going to be on Tolkien. So I want to make sure people know that. And like, I'm a professor and I'm pretty much going to be lecturing. So I feel like that, there needs to be a warning, like right on the label, that's what's going to be happening. So if you're not into that, this might not be what you want. So I'm like, okay, the Tolkien Professor, sure. And I did not even think through the implications of the definite article there, but it just kind of happened, and I've been living with it for 10 years.
That's excellent, and I've really appreciated the way you've been digging into Tolkien and Lewis. I've just started your Out of the Silent Planet lectures, and just to see, like, it's not every day that I listen to a podcast about fantasy literature where I hear someone really talk about meaning and where I hear someone making biblical references as well as you do. Not that I know that your podcast isn't a Christian one, but I just found that really refreshing. Just bringing out the meaning in things I thought made you a natural choice for us to say, hey, if we want to talk about Tolkien and Lewis, you'd be the guy we would like to talk to.
No, it's so much fun to do. And I'm a Christian myself. I've been a Christian my whole life. And it's one of the things that I've been working to do both in my podcast and at Signum. Of course, Signum is, we're not religiously affiliated. I've worked really hard to keep that independent, because we want to be open to everybody is the primary goal there. And thus far, we've really succeeded very well in that. But yeah, I'm not gonna hide from the stuff that's there. I mean, with Lewis and Tolkien, you can't really avoid that. You shouldn't really. If you're avoiding the Christian stuff, you're doing it wrong. So I mean, I do want to. I always do want to talk about that. Trying to go into it, trying to grind a Christian axe or something. But when it's there, we'll definitely talk about it. And there's always enough folks who are really interested in the Christian side of things during the live sessions that usually I have to kind of rein it in rather than needing to try to encourage it. It definitely is stuff that pretty naturally comes out. But yeah, as far as meaning, I mean, that's the fun thing, right? I mean, it's not about. And this actually I learned from Lewis, C.S. Lewis. One of his quote. I believe this is from his essay on criticism, where it kind of changed my life at one point. When I was in grad school, undergrad and grad school, I used to be like hugely resistant to the critical theory ideas. People were always talking about the death of the author, and even when I was in grad school, that was an old concept, of course. But still, the idea of, as you say, like finding meaning in a text was a long since outdated idea, right? And I was resistant against that, right? But I didn't exactly know what I was opposing in a sense. So I knew I was opposed to like the kind of postmodernist relativist stuff that was going on in graduate school. But the kind of the thing that I would focus on, I was like, okay, no, this, like, the author isn't actually dead, right? Like, there is something here, and I'm not going to just treat it like it's mine to do with however I want. Like, that's not, doesn't make any sense. I wouldn't do that when I'm talking to a person. Why should I do that when I'm reading a book? But the thing that Lewis said, which changed my life, was he said, authors intend books mean. Like authors have intentions, books have meaning, and the disconnection between those things. And it was Tolkien, and so like, you know, Lewis said that, and then Tolkien showed me what it meant. Basically, as I went through, and this actually, it's been the Mythgard Academy series, as we've been going through the History of Middle-earth series, looking at the growth and development of Tolkien's whole, you know, mythology and stories over time, right? And watching how the meaning of his books emerged, right? Often beyond his control, beyond his expectation. I mean, he had no idea. When he got to Rivendell, he really believed The Lord of the Rings was halfway done. He was like, that was the middle point, and from there it was just, you know, the jaunt to Mordor from Rivendell, and you know, he was halfway. He had no idea what was going on in, like, what was to come in that book. You know, he didn't even know about Sauron. I mean, he knew he had Sauron kind of as a pre-existing character, but he didn't know about like the Lord of the Rings and the ring wraiths and everything until one literally showed up. I mean, there's that awesome moment when the Black Rider, you know, when Frodo and Sam and Pippin are walking down the road, and then they ditch off to the side of the road when they hear the horse coming, because they think it might be Gandalf, and so they're gonna like scare him or something, right, as a joke. And then it turns out to be the Black Rider, and, right, and it's this really like spooky, intimidating moment. When you look at the drafts, like you can see this in The Return of the Shadow, Volume 6 of the History of Middle-earth. When Tolkien first wrote that passage, it was Gandalf. Like, he wrote a version where then they saw a white horse come around the corner, and it was Gandalf. Even the sniffing, like, you remember the Black Rider sniffs for them, and it's really creepy.
Yes.
It was Gandalf sniffing, actually. Like, he detected them by scent in that. Gandalf did in that first draft, right? But then immediately after writing one paragraph, he goes back and he crosses out the word white and he writes the word black. It was a black horse that came around the corner, and he had no idea. Like, and then he describes this black figure. Tolkien did not know what the black figure on the black horse was, except that it was apparently really scary, right? And then he figured it all out. So again, the way that the whole story like unfolds, he had no idea where he was going or what he was doing. This was not a question of like the author's intention, in a sense. It was what the author was discovering, and the way in which you see that, like, okay, so not only is the intention of the author different from the meaning of a book, but the meaning is something that actually emerges often can be, and I think in the best books, so it usually is not completely under the control of the author. And what's more is in a kind of there's a kind of partnership with the reader, right? I mean, like, the reader is involved in finding that meaning, and there can be, you know, you can find things that, you know, that can have really deep meaning for you. There's so many times I've talked to Tolkien fans who are deeply moved or have been really, you know, their lives have been transformed by a particular passage of The Lord of the Rings, and I'm like, I never thought about that passage that way. That never had that meaning to me, right? But that's really cool to hear the way that that has been kind of mediated to you, and the way that that's had an impact in your life. And so just seeing the depth of the ways in which, you know, meaning comes across, and, you know, in which, you know, frankly, in which God can speak to people through these things in so many different ways. It's been just kind of an incredible discovery for me to sort of watch that. And so anyway, so, you know, if I can sort of, you know, by sharing what I see, you know, and what really speaks to me in these texts, and the kind of patterns that I see and what seems to be happening, being able to kind of tee that up for folks and help them to sort of see and understand some stuff is, that's what's just, it's so rewarding. And these, you know, Lewis and Tolkien both are just, you know, their works are almost bottomless when it comes to this kind of impact.
Definitely. This is a great starting point here, because we've been really interested in talking about this idea of mythology in both Lewis and Tolkien, and how sometimes I think, you know, a lot of Christians are wary of the word mythology, because we think of it as something that is, you know, not true. It's fictional. It's not rooted in history or something. But your work on Tolkien has really tried to focus on, there's something really important, a goal, if you will, at the end of kind of what he's trying to do with Lord of the Rings. And I'm curious as well, because I know that I know that Lewis and Tolkien had this relationship. They were part of the Inklings, right? They were friends and they would write and talk. But my understanding is that Tolkien didn't really like Lewis's allegorical way of doing things. So yeah, I wonder if you could just talk about, mythology and its purpose for Tolkien, how maybe that was different than Lewis's, why he was a little bit critical of going so hardcore Christian with the motifs and themes there.
Well, in large part, I think that was mostly a difference in temperament between the two of them. Like, they were very, very different personalities, Lewis and Tolkien were. And I mean, there were obviously lots of things they had in common, and they were good friends, but they were very, very different people. So Tolkien's discomfort with Lewis, and I'll try to remember to circle back to mythology, but Tolkien's discomfort especially with Narnia. Well, okay, so there are a couple factors here to keep in mind. Number one, and I just had to kind of get this out of the way at first. Sure. Tolkien disliked Narnia because of the way that Lewis's mind worked so differently. Tolkien was like way more OCD than Lewis. Like, Lewis was really free and easy and kind of didn't care. Narnia drove Tolkien bananas because it's so chaotic, right? I mean, he reads The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? He starts reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and he's like, okay, so there's a magic wardrobe, that's cool, and then there's a faun, right? There's a Greek faun, and there's a Norse dwarf, and there's a witch, right? From who knows what that's from, and then bloody Santa Claus comes in. Like, are you kidding me? What's even happening here?
Pick a lane, Lewis. Pick a lane. Yeah,
exactly. He was like, I can't even with this, right? You know, like, it just drove him crazy. He couldn't stand that. And I've always actually considered that kind of ironic, even kind of tragic, because I think that what Lewis is doing in Narnia, and especially in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, actually, like, before Lewis does pick a lane, like, eventually Narnia kind of settles down. I mean, it always has those different elements and stuff at its origins, but it kind of does settle down into it's the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is way more eclectic than like most of the rest of the books are. You know, he's not really established the world of Narnia yet, right? In the early parts of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And what you can see there is the way, like, myth is what he's primarily interested in, right? I mean, this is what they're coming in contact. Like, Narnia is like the world, which is like the reality behind mythic stories in our world, right? And you can even see ways in which they've been turned. So, like, even one of the things that annoyed Tolkien, he was not only annoyed, offended isn't quite the right word, scandalized might be the right word. The whole Mr. Tumnus thing, right? Because I mean, Mr. Tumnus's bookshelf, you know, the books about like nymphs and their ways, and like there is a long, robust history, of course, in Greek mythology about fauns kidnapping girls, but they don't give them tea parties, if you know what I mean. I mean, it's like, you know, so he's like, Lewis is invoking this like really sort of sketchy thing and converting it, right, sort of twisting it around, and making it so that, and basically what we're able to see is that, like, so all those Greek myths about, you know, fauns like kidnapping and raping mortal girls, those are just like warped and twisted versions of the reality that's actually out there right now. Of course, Mr. Tumnus does kidnap Lucy with bad intentions, right? So again, even that's not totally wrong. Like, it's, you know, if you took away from Greek mythology that fauns are not to be trusted, you wouldn't be wrong when you met Mr. Tumnus, right? Not for the right reasons and not in the right way. Anyway, so like the way that Lewis is playing with that stuff is really, really interesting. But Tolkien was just like, he couldn't handle it. Like, his mind was just blown and he couldn't handle it. But as far as the Christian teaching is concerned, it wasn't exactly the allegorical method. A lot of people, and for okay, another little sidelight. Lewis isn't exactly doing allegory. And I've gotten in trouble so many times. Oh my goodness. Like, I get in trouble with my own parents if I say that Lewis is not writing allegory. Because when I say, if I say the Chronicles of Narnia is not an allegory to Christians. They almost all, what they hear is, there is no Christian story that's actually being told. And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying. Like, yeah, of course there is. It's just not like, that's not the method. It's not an allegory. Because if it were an allegory, like really an allegory, and Lewis can do allegory, and he does allegory in The Pilgrim's Regress. You want to read his allegory, read The Pilgrim's Regress. That's allegory, right? All the way through. But that's not what he's doing in Narnia. I mean, yes, I mean, you can say like, okay, so Aslan is Jesus and the witch is Satan, kind of, but she's not exactly. It already starts to break down. She's not exactly Satan, but she's like Satan in a lot of ways. And then what is Edmund? The human soul,
right.
You know, and if Edmund is that, what's Susan? You know, what's Mr. Beaver? Like, it's not an allegory. It breaks down. It doesn't work as an allegory in that way.
Can I jump in? Was that ever a thing for Tolkien? Was that a criticism in a way? Because it does seem, you're right. It's like Lewis has all these connections, but they're not quite there. But it's just so overt in one sense. And yet it doesn't all square. Was that ever something Tolkien was just like, what are you doing?
Well, in some ways, again, I do think that it is a testimony to Lewis's more free and easy approach, you know, to this kind of writing and this kind of teaching. In some ways, in some ways, Tolkien might almost have been more comfortable if it had been a consistent allegory, because then at least it would have been something, right? It would have been some kind of consistent system. But yeah, like the connection between Aslan and Jesus is not allegorical. Aslan isn't an allegory of Jesus. Aslan is Jesus, right? It's Jesus in it. I mean, it's a supposal, right? If the Son of God were to manifest in another world, how much, if there were to be other worlds and the Son of God were manifested there, what might that be like? How might he interact with that world? I mean, that's
very important.
Like, I mean,
in later works, he's pretty overt about that, right?
Very overt about that. Exactly. You should get to know me by another name. So yeah, he's not an allegory of Jesus. He's Jesus, right? I mean, like he's more
of a figural reading. This I've heard C.S. Lewis described as a figural reader. So he literally, it is Jesus. It is Jesus. World.
It's not an allegory. So yeah. Anyway, but as I say, whenever I say it's not an allegory, I almost always I can see it like in the eyes of Christians that I'm talking to. They think I'm attacking the Christian. I'm like, no, don't misunderstand. It's stronger than that. Actually, it's not. But anyway, so back to Tolkien. Tolkien's biggest problem was he was not comfortable being a Christian teacher. And I mean, part of this is the Catholic thing. That is definitely a big part of this. You know, it was sort of part of his culture as a Catholic, right? That like this is the priest's job, right? Like, I'm a layman. It's not my job to teach doctrine. And he's looking at Lewis and he's like, and who are you exactly? Who are you, Mr. Adult Convert, whom I remember as an atheist a few years back, and like, now you're going to teach everybody. Maybe you should leave this to the professionals. I don't know. But like, Tolkien was just not comfortable with that. And of course, Lewis's response was, as soon as the professionals start doing it, I'll leave it to them. Right? But since they're not, somebody need to. And also, again, as I say, it's also just a difference in temperament.
That does make a lot of sense, though. That pieces together. I'm very interested by that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I did one of the first courses I ever did actually at Signum. I taught was in our graduate program was my Lewis and Tolkien class, where I really kind of went through Lewis and Tolkien, and I took. I didn't do. It wasn't like a normal sort of survey where I just like read their major works or something. What I did was I took pairs of works in which they're doing similar kinds of things. From a literary perspective, like they're doing so like, for instance, I read The Hobbit and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe back to back, both like juvenile fairy tales involving the movement from like a normal mundane world into a world of adventure and back, right? You can see that same pattern in both of them. So let's look at these and compare and contrast how they approach that particular topic. We did anyway, there's a bunch of pairings that we did in these respects, and the conclusion that I really felt compelled to at the end of that study was, at the end of the day, Tolkien is a poet, Lewis is a teacher. Right. I mean, like, he can't help himself. Lewis is a teacher. Like, it's it doesn't just mean that he's like, it wasn't just that he had like these particular like doctrinal points that he really wanted to get out there. He's a teacher. It is in his bones. He can't help himself. Like, he's always thinking through, and so his fiction, even his greatest fiction, is still involved. There's still teaching that's happening there. Whereas Tolkien is perfectly comfortable. Unlike Lewis, Tolkien is perfectly comfortable just leaving something there and not emphasizing it all. I mean, people, thousands, millions of people have read The Lord of the Rings without the faintest suspicion that it is a Christian work.
I had that experience myself. The first time I read The Lord of the Rings, I was a teenager who wasn't really serious about his faith. But then I came back to God and made a serious commitment as a young adult and read it again. And I was like, suddenly the curtain was pulled back, and I'm like, Jesus is all over this, like there's so much of God and so much of the gospel and such. For Christians' standpoint, like for many Christians who read the Lord of the Rings or hear about the Lord of the Rings or whatever, a lot of Christians have been spoiled by Lewis, right? They read they read the Chronicles of Narnia, and they're like, okay, no, that's Christian literature. Right? All right, that's what I'm talking about, right? And then they read the Lord of the Rings, and they're like, is this actually Christian? I don't really know. And it's almost as if, like, well, in order for Christian to be like for Tolkien to be a real Christian author, right, then he's got to have a message, right? He's got to have a message, and he doesn't. He's not pushing a message. He really is, to a very great, just leaving the story out there and letting it do its work, whatever that work may be. And he's willing to just sort of let that go. It's not in his hands. Like, that's not his job. And that's not how he thinks about it.
So then when you talk about, because if he's less didactic clearly than what Lewis is doing, but you do talk about, he has a goal though with this mythology, right? I mean, he has a sort of sense in which he wants it to do something, right? I mean,
yes.
What is he aimed at?
Well, see, I don't know. It's hard.
Or is it just the beauty?
Aim is a hard word.
Storytelling. Okay. Yeah.
Sort of. Okay. Let's go back to myth, because I think myth will get us back there again. Okay. Because I said I didn't want to leave mythology behind, but then I did. So mythology, the biggest thing that modern people have to get over, the biggest obstacle to get over, like if you as a modern reader want to understand anything of what Lewis and Tolkien meant by myth, or to say the same thing, what myth meant to Lewis and Tolkien, you have to get over one really simple thing. The word mythology has changed, has developed over the course of the last 100 years, especially the last 75 years. The word myth has come first and foremost to me. Like, if you call something a myth, what are you saying about it?
It's
Number
not
one.
true.
It's false. Exactly.
False.
Right. Falsehood is the idea of falsehood. That is now the premier, and in some cases, the only concept that's connected with the word. There are a lot of people who use the word myth merely to mean that's wrong or that's false. Right.
Myth versus
and
fact.
so exactly. Myth versus fact.
Yeah.
And so, like the whole Mythbusters concept, right, of mythology, urban myth, all that kind of thing. And so if you don't detach that idea at all, right? I mean, if falsehood is central to your idea of what the word myth means, you're never going to understand, because the word myth to Lewis and Tolkien means something close to opposite of that. A myth is something that is true, like transcendently true, beyond the details of the story. Like it is a myth is a story that points to truth, like capital T truth, in ways often that the people who hear the myth, and even the people who make the mythic stories don't themselves fully understand. It is a way of communicating the incommunicable, and the incommunicable that is communicated is truth. Like it is like myth is the way. Again, this is now I'm getting into more of the way that Lewis would talk about this than the way that Tolkien would talk about this. But if God is the father of lights, right, and all people at all times have had some degree of truth, mediated to them by the Spirit, if in as much as all of creation bears witness to the Creator, and nobody has been born who has no glimmer of truth, no idea of ultimate reality. And I mean, there's some at least mediated, limited understanding of the this is Romans 1 stuff, right? That God has revealed all these things to his creatures and through his creation, in as much as everybody has some sense of that. The way they articulate that, the way they try to approach that, is through myth, through mythology, by telling stories. And so you can see this in this in varying degrees in what we call mythology, like what we use that word for, that is the ancient stories of these different people, some of the stories being religious stories, some of them not necessarily religious stories in a way that, I mean, something like the Iliad, for instance, not a religious story exactly, but a mythic story, a mythological story. And in these things we can see, like you could see again, to varying degrees and in varying different ways, there is something real, with something about God, about the human condition, about the way the world works. There is something that you can learn, even as a Christian, something you can learn about what it means to be human by reading the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, for instance. This is the example that Lewis gave in his book, An Experiment in Criticism, when he was talking about myth. And by the way, if there were one short thing that I would urge people to, if you want like the most like Cliff's Notesy version of the Lewis and Tolkien approach to mythology, it's the chapter on myth in Lewis's Experiment in Criticism. Experiment in Criticism was written at the end of, it was one of the last things he wrote. I think it was the last like literary critical thing that he wrote. And he wrote a chapter on myth. And there he lays out like the definition of mythology, what it is and why it's important, more like succinctly and clearly than anywhere else that I know of in either one of their works. And I don't want to, you can never sloppily assume that Tolkien and Lewis thought the same way about things, even about things like myth that they, that meant a lot to them both and they talked about together. But anyway.
Well, if I could jump in there, I think
Sure.
you said so much that's great there. And I think this is what, we've been trying to hit on this a little bit too, in the sense that, like I said, I think so many Christians are wary of that word mythology, but in the way that you've defined it, we see that it's integral even to our understanding of the Bible and stuff.
Absolutely.
With Tolkien and Lewis, what I find interesting is that they really seem at ease with borrowing from extra biblical sources, pagan sources, learning about things. There's a deep natural theology, it seems, within Tolkien. And I'm wondering, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, about their, why was that okay to them? Because also you see a lot of Christians who are wary of this sort of stuff. I mean, it's like the same with Harry Potter. They're like, I don't want my kids reading something with wizards and goblins and orcs, right?
Yeah, I grew up in the age of the Satanic Panic, so I know all about that. When I was a teenager, you're reading The Lord of the Rings, you're going straight to HE double hockey stick.
I was able to bypass that, but yes, that is a common story, Colin's narrative.
That's a way of Ben saying I'm old.
No, I hear that. Yeah. I mean, it's true. I can barely even wrap my head around somebody who is too young for the Harry Potter phenomenon. But hey, like it's what can I say? We're old, I guess, Colin. But anyway, but I agree. Like that's Yeah, and boy, I fought so hard back in those days. Like I was fighting like a desperate rearguard action. I tried at first to like argue. I'm like, guys, like I'm not the biggest Harry Potter fan in the world, but you're not doing this right. Like you're barking up the wrong tree here. However, I swiftly just began like a desperate rearguard action to try to defend Tolkien from getting thrown onto the bonfires along with Harry Potter. I'm like, okay, I don't think I can save Harry Potter, and I don't think I want to die on that hill anyway. But Tolkien, yes, like here I stand on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, and I am not giving this up. So I used to have a lot of those discussions back in the day. But yes, so as far as the pagan mythology, again, this is because they began with this understanding of, and again, let's take Lewis, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. Lewis is very open, and you can read about this most powerfully, I think, in Surprised by Joy, his autobiography, right? Where you can see, and he's very clear on the ways in which what he perceived in mythology, like what Norse mythology meant to him growing up, like the way in which his path to God came, not despite, but through pagan mythology. Now, that's not to say, and he would not be the one to say, that's how you do it, right? So the first step is let's teach everybody Norse mythology, and it'll lead everybody, obviously, directly to God. Like it's not a recommendation in that way. But since he came from that, like that was his whole experience. He first perceived, these things about God, he first had these experiences through Norse mythology. And so there was no way else that he could possibly understand it. There was no way that he was going to go into writing being like, well, I got to be careful talking about Norse mythology because maybe it will lead people to Satan. Like he knew, what it could do. And having tasted that himself, he came to it with this principle that, everybody who's talking about God, they're doing it because they have some perception of God. Again, it's the Romans 1 principle, right? And so if you start from there and move forward, rather than saying, this isn't 100% right, and therefore could lead to error, could get people to, or could, even in the worst case, lead people to worshiping false gods or have like vastly wrong ideas about God. He was less concerned in that way about like doctrinal purity and more about saying, let us perceive and understand the ways in which, because even the Vikings had an experience of God, right? And how can we see that? What can we learn from that? Because that's the other thing, is that even from non-Christian cultures, what they're perceiving is, again, they're perceiving God, and then they're mediating it, and then you can see, and yes, of course, it's going to be corrupted and twisted in various ways, right? It's not the undiluted truth of God that you're getting through them, but that doesn't mean that they're not perceiving things of God, and that even there are things we can learn from them. There might be some things about God that they perceive more clearly than we do because they're different. And Lewis was throughout his life a very big proponent of reading old books. It's a Lewis essay I love to recommend on the reading of old books. That you can, you avoid becoming narrow-minded and parochial by traveling around, right? If you never travel anywhere and you only ever like meet one set group of people and spend your whole life in one place with one group of people, you're going to have a narrow view. Like there's going to be lots of things that you will have never considered and lots of perspectives that you will have never seen. Well, through books, we can travel in time, right? We can expose ourselves in time, and people who only like watch the news, right, and pay attention to what is happening right now, can be fruitfully refreshed in your perspective about lots of things, including like there are ways in which we as Christians can have our own assumptions about, God and what God has for us kind of calcified and influenced in ways that we're not even aware of by the non-Christian culture around us, right? And so reading other Christian works from earlier time periods, right? From other time, as he said, the books of the future are not accessible to us, so we must content ourselves with the books of the past, right? It helps to refresh our perspective, and this is true even of non-Christian works. Can also refresh our perspectives in some way. There are things that we can learn. There are things that we can see, even when what we're seeing is like them answering a question or asking a question they don't have the answer to. Right. And we might see that, right. We, as eventually Lewis came to see, that that Jesus was the answer that, that Norse mythology was asking in a lot of ways, that there were a lot of ways in which it was pointing. In particular, he talks about, the myth of the god Balder, the dying and rising god Balder, and the grief for the death of the god Balder, and it was through that lens that he came to the story of the resurrection of Jesus, and that the way in which he was able to just again see so clearly his own experience taught him that yes, like these other ideas, these other mythologies are, they're groping at it, right? They were seeing stuff, but they didn't get it, they didn't understand it. And the fact that we have that revelation, right, enables us. It doesn't excuse us from having to read it all like, well, so now why should I bother with the groping, right? Why should I bother with Norse mythology or whatever, or whatever, because I now I know the real story, right? But instead, you can be amazingly enriched by going back to it from that perspective, and they clearly were. And so, in their own writings, they are. There is much of the mythic power of those old stories that they use, that they incorporate, that they invoke themselves, though both of them are invoking it. I keep talking about Norse because that's the mythology that the two of them most had in common. I mean, that was really kind of like the premise of their whole friendship, basically. They became friends because they were both into Norse mythology. Like that's, Tolkien taught Lewis Old Norse.
Oh, right.
Tolkien started a group. Tolkien wasn't an innate teacher like Lewis, but he was really into like small groups. Like he loved like getting together in small groups of friends for stuff. So he started this this group called the Coal Biters, meaning that like you huddle so close to the fire, it's like you're biting the coals. And so like they all gather around the fire, and they would just read Old Norse aloud, and like he just kind of like walked them through it. These are people who didn't know Old Norse at all, and he's like, let's get together and read Old Norse poetry and you'll pick it up, right? And that's how Lewis learned to read Old Norse from Tolkien at the Coal Biters. So anyway, so yeah, the Norse, I keep coming back to Norse because it's what they most had in common, though both of them knew Greco-Roman stuff very, very well. People both of often underestimate that with Tolkien, but yeah. But anyway, the Norse was what they loved, both what they loved most. So anyway, that's why I keep using that as an example. But in both of them, you can see them, their own stories, the kind of Christian myths, and talk about phrases that make Christians uncomfortable. Christian mythology, oh man, like the looks I get if I utter that phrase, right? But again, all that means is that Christian stories also have this mythic power, right? And the difference, and this is, a thing that Tolkien told Lewis during the process of his conversion, that, this is one of the conversations that Lewis and Tolkien had that was really part of Lewis's conversion process, was that in Christianity, and in Christianity alone, myth became fact, right? It's like the only, it is a myth. Like the story of the incarnation and resurrection is the most powerful myth ever told.
Right.
And the difference is it happened. Like it is also history. Unlike Balder, right? Unlike Osiris, unlike the other dying and unlike the other myths of the the Corn King and the the dying and rising god whose death brings about the blessing of the crops and everything else that you get in so many different religions. In this one time, it as Lewis says, it seems to have actually happened,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And again, which is what helped Lewis to see, yes, this is not only a myth, this is the myth that's behind.
It doesn't negate the mythology. It actually elevates it. It brings it into a
exactly
whole, yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And helps helps to understand, get things like that. I mean, like the Bible is full. I mean, goodness, the first 11 chapters of Genesis are some of the most powerfully mythic stories ever told. I mean, the story of the flood, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of the Tower of Babel, like all that stuff. It's just incredibly powerful mythology. But again, but that first step, you've got to divorce myth and falsehood in your head. If you can separate those, so that myth doesn't mean falsehood, then you can begin being a little bit more comfortable talking in this way. And it helps. It really helps, I think, a lot to get there.
Certainly, yeah. And it's that mythic quality, I think, that makes it bottomless, right? I mean, it makes it something that you can continuously revisit and get more and more out of it every time. Absolutely.
And it's not only that's the style, especially of those stories. I mean, there are other stories that, like other Old Testament stories, that have great mythic power to them as well. And by great mythic, I mean, these are stories that even people who didn't believe it at all, right, would find interesting and moving, in the same way that we can find Greek myths or Norse myths really moving. There are many, Greek myths that I find deeply stirring stories, that do really seem to touch something. And again, I think even people who did not believe anything at all about the Bible would still find the stories, like the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, or the story of the, like the falling of the walls of Jericho, right? There are lots of stories like that, which David and Goliath, good grief, right? You can see how powerfully mythic that story is just from the fact that people make reference to it every single year during the NCAA tournament. Like you can't have, it's like a law. You can't go through the NCAA tournament without making allusions to David and Goliath. But anyway, like I said, there are these powerful mythic stories, but like those first stories, chapters 1 through 11 of Genesis, like those are like the style of mythology, right? I mean, they are told that it's like, this is those are really, really powerful mythic stories, which again, like you can have a different relationship to. Again, it's not, you detach myth from falsehood, right? It's nothing about that. But those stories are so obviously even different from like Jericho or David and Goliath or Abraham and Isaac, right? Like the story of the Tower of Babel, the story of the Garden of Eden. It is designed to be like suggestive, right? It is designed to evoke ideas, feelings. I mean, it points to truth, but it points to truth in the way that mythology points to truth. It's not like a story that has a moral, right? It's not, or like a story that can be applied to our lives in some ways. It is, I mean, it is that, but it's more than that, right? It's not within the same kind of context. Anyway, so yeah, once you can kind of get this concept of myth the way that it meant to them, I find it becomes really helpful in it's really, Lewis and Tolkien have had a big impact in this way, I think, on my own Bible reading, actually, for this reason.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I'm also interested in is our Christian themes and narratives that appear in Tolkien. And it's interesting to kind of contrast him with Lewis in this way. Like we were saying, Lewis a little bit more didactic, obviously kind of teaching, but the kind of sense that you get from reading any of their fiction, that, the nature of good and evil and the battle that goes on there is something I've always found quite interesting. That there's a clear sense, I think, for both Lewis and Tolkien, that it is up to us to fight the powers of evil. That, we are kind of called on that to, that's for us to do. And one of the contrasts that I've seen, I'm just curious what you think of this, is that you tend to find in Lewis there's a sort of overarching sense that evil is kind of lurking everywhere, that it's pervasive and that it sort of taints everything and whatever. Whereas in Tolkien, it seems like the reverse emphasis, not to say that they both don't do a little bit of both, but that Tolkien is really, he doesn't seem to bring evil front and center all the time. It's actually sort of, I've heard somebody describe this as, you know, you talk about Gandalf and the battle with the Balrog. It actually doesn't get a whole lot of description in Lord of the Rings. He doesn't really, and for him, it's more about pervasive good. What do you think of that theme? Is that a fair contrast there? Is that something you find in Tolkien as a theme?
So, sort of, yes. Yeah, well, yes and no. On the one hand, yeah, I think it's a perfectly fair reading of the Lord of the Rings. That Tolkien is that, like, as you were talking about, the less emphasis on the sort of pervasiveness of evil, right? Like evil kind of tainting everything. I think that is true in the Lord of the Rings. What we see in the Lord of the Rings, which has led to a lot of misunderstanding, actually, especially among people who don't actually read it very carefully and don't really want to read it very much. He tends to externalize it, right? So we have localized evil in a sense, right? Like in Sauron and the Orcs, right? There's the Dark Lord, and the Orcs are like completely evil sort of quasi constructs, right? So these are not like redeemable souls. Footnote: this is a major issue. This is the biggest issue. This is the biggest problem in Middle Earth is orcs, where they come from, and like what is their ultimate like spiritual destiny. Tolkien never solved this problem. It's a fundamental theological crisis that Tolkien has later on, trying to figure out and explain orcs, and he never actually fully did it before he died. But anyway, end footnote. So Tolkien externalizes evil, right? And so we get these like forces. So you do have in Gandalf and the Balrog, in the whole struggle against Sauron, in battles against the orcs, right? The advantage that he gains in the storytelling by the orcs, right? The orcs they create theological problems, but you can see why. Like, it was worth it to create the theological problems, because what you get is you get enemies that are okay to fight, like evil, concrete evil, tangible evil, that it's okay to fight. Like, it's okay to fight and to kill because they're just evil. We get a glimpse of this once. Lewis points to this once in Paralandra, if you remember the passage in Paralandra where Ransom realizes when he's fighting against the unman, right? He sort of realizes, I'm fighting against the devil here, and he hates him. Right. And he hates, and he describes this liberating moment, right? When he finally realizes what hatred is for. Like, he'd always his whole life, Ransom, the main character, he said his whole life, he had always felt hatred to be wrong on some level, right? And he'd never really like understood it. Like, what is hatred? Merely sin? Right? Like hatred is never okay, because there had always been a problem about the sin and the sinner. Right. It's okay to hate the sin, but you can't ever hate anybody, because that's wrong. Right. But then when it's like the principle of evil itself that he's fighting, he's like,
it's righteous. Yeah.
This is hatred. Like, this is what I can, it's like, this is what hatred is for. Like, this is why we have it. This is the pure virtuous hatred, of which all other hatreds are a corruption. Right. And he has this like liberating moment where he realizes the purpose of hatred. We get that in Tolkien, right? Except we get that everywhere in Tolkien. It's like a big part of the landscape of Tolkien's work. It's okay. It's good to resist the orcs and hate the orcs and resist the Balrog. Like, there's nothing wrong about fighting them, about standing up to them. So Tolkien externalizes the evil in this way. And I think that might be one of the things that you're sort of perceiving there when you're talking about with Tolkien. It's not as much kind of not diluted, but sort of dispersed through everything. It's more sort of centralized. Now, the error that I mentioned before, that this has led many people to, is the idea that Tolkien's world, and more specifically, his characters are really simplistic and all very black and white. It's true, there are completely black characters, but there are almost no completely white characters. C.S. Lewis, I just recently came across, again, Lewis's, I just actually yesterday finished rereading Lewis's essay, so grateful for the complete collection of Lewis's short works put out on audiobook several years back. That was so huge. I just love that collection. Anyway, so I just finished rereading all of C.S. Lewis's essays again, and included in that are the 2 reviews that he wrote of the Lord of the Rings when the Fellowship of the Ring and then when the Two Towers came out. And in his review of the Two Towers, C.S. Lewis talks about this explicitly. He says, okay, we can now put to bed forever the silly reading that so many people, the silly criticism that so many people have given of the Lord of the Rings, that all of his characters are simplistic and black and white. Though he says how anyone could have ever maintained that argument when the culminating event of the Return of the King, or sorry, of the Fellowship of the Ring, was like the internal struggle and temptation to evil, and then eventual redemption of Boromir, right? Like, you know, how you can read that and come away with saying all of his characters are either completely good or completely evil. Like, it's just, yeah, like, well, if you ignore Boromir and Saruman and Frodo and Gollum and everybody in the book, then yeah, it's true.
Because that's a definite theme, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Tolkien, in fact, The Lord of the Rings does a better job than most. I mean, one of the things it does really, really well is really show you, not just tell you, but show you how the path can be walked, right? How you can set out wanting to do the right thing with good intentions and end up going down the path of evil. Like, that's a really subtle thing, and Tolkien does it really well, showing it in lots of different stages and lots of people going different ways, and some turning back and some not turning back, right? I mean, goodness, even if you just think of the Gondorian stewardly royal family, right? Boromir and Faramir and Denethor, right? And the 3 of them show like different stages of that, right? They all have the same kind of temptation, right? Faramir does best, Denethor does worst, Boromir is in the middle, right? But all 3 of them, you can see, all 3 of them are great people with great intentions, right? But they all, you know, and they all come out there anyway. So as I say, I get irritated by.
And even Gandalf and Galadriel, 2 of the most good characters, both when they're offered the ring are tempted by it, but say, no, I can't. Yes. Not that they're so good that they're above it, but that they're so good that they're like, I know that that's a weakness, so I'm saying no to it.
Yeah, especially Galadriel, right? Especially Galadriel, you know, when Frodo offers her the ring and she's like, funny you should offer me that, because I've been trying to resist this temptation ever since you walked into these woods, right? And so now it comes to it, yeah, okay, I'm going to resist temptation. But she then, in that famous speech, which Peter Jackson made so psychedelic, you know, that, you know, in place of the Dark Lord, you would have a queen, right? That speech, you know, she shows like, oh, I've thought about it. Like, you know, I have wrestled with this and I have seen this is what lies at the end of that road, right? But she only knows that because she's thought about it, right? And she's really, you know, and it came, to use her own phrase, to the edge of a knife, you know, whether she would stand or fall. And she stood. So that was good, but she's not simple. Anyway, but one last thing, Ben, I want to add is that I said that what you were saying about evil being sort of less dispersed in that way, or distributed, I'm not sure exactly the right verb to use, but anyway, I said that I do think that that's a good reading of the Lord of the Rings. But there's an interesting fact, and that is, if you go back further, if you go back to the Silmarillion and his fundamental mythology, Tolkien actually talks about the corruption, about like the dispersion of evil into all things even more explicitly than Lewis ever does.
Interesting.
You know, this is the whole idea of, so Arda is his word for like the solar system, like the world, basically. The world is Arda. And he talks about, Arda marred, right? Arda has been marred. Like this is what, like the, original sin, the creation, which, groans for release, moving from Romans 1 to Romans 8 now, right? That concept is a core concept of his mythology. Like his mythology is the mythology of a world that was created good by God, and through the mediation, through the sub-creative abilities of created beings, right? So it's God working in harmony with the free will of the creatures that he has created in order to create the history of this world, which he intends to be good and is going to be good no matter what happens, but which becomes corrupted, which becomes, and discord is brought into that. Discord is brought into the music, and the Satan figure, Melkor. Sauron is not the Satan figure. Sauron was the junior partner of the Satan figure. Sauron is like what would happen if, like one of Satan's, junior lieutenants, sets up for himself and becomes reasonably successful, in the world. Like that's who Sauron is. He's just one of the demons, basically. Yeah, exactly. Right. If Wormwood made it big for a while, he would be Sauron. Exactly. But anyway, yeah. So that idea of like that the world has been marred. But and there's that wonderful speech that God, that Iluvatar, Eru, the one, gives to the Ainur. This is all from the Ainulindale, the very first section of the Silmarillion. The Ainulindale, which means the music of the Ainur, the holy ones, the angelic host, which is essentially Tolkien's myth of creation. At the end of, so the Satan figure has been rebelling, right? He's gone into rebellion, and he's trying to set up and to elevate his part in the music and make it more prominent, and then to take over and guide the themes and determine the music and everything. He's doing all that. And then at the end, Iluvatar says, none of you can alter the music in my despite. Like, what you have done is going to redound to my glory and the goodness, like all that you have done, all the evil that you have intended, all of the ways in which you have tried to influence is going to but increase the glory of the whole, right? And you'll see that will happen, right? But again, Tolkien is really, really firm on the idea of providence. Like God is, that things are not out of control. Like things might seem disordered, right? Things are evil and out of control, and sin is rampant in the world, but that doesn't mean it's out of God's control or that God's purposes are being thwarted, right? And Tolkien is really clear on that sort of doctrinal point. But at the same time, he does not lose sight of the fact that it, to quote Menway, the chief of the Valar, the chief of the good guys, ruling over the world, the powers ruling over the world. Well, he talks about this, and then it's Mandos who says, and yet it remains evil, right? Like it doesn't change the fact that the world is indeed corrupted, and Arda has been marred. The elves talk about art. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So I was just going to say, Corey, can you just speak briefly to the influences that Tolkien took in, where he comes through with that? I mean, Boethius. Can you geek out with us a bit on
Absolutely. It's actually, it's really funny, because just last night, I've been talking about like the Boethius influence on Tolkien's thought for a long time, and I'm currently doing so when we're recording this, I'm in the middle of my Mythgard Academy discussion of The Nature of Middle-earth, the new book that was just released, edited by Carl Hostetter, which contains like the first new Tolkien, like Middle-earth content released to the general public in 20 years. Like it's the other books that, the Baron and Luthien book, the Fall of Gondolin book, all that stuff is cool. It's really awesome, but we already had that. It's all in the history of Middle-earth. It's been repackaged and excellently, right? And so a lot of people are reading it for the first time, which is cool, but we knew it already, right? This has stuff that Tolkien wrote that has either never ever seen the light of day yet, or has only been published in some pretty obscure places that only scholars have seen. So anyway, so I'm going through this, right? And I just got to the fate and free will chapter last night. I'm making notes for tonight's class. I don't think we're ever going to get to it. We'll probably get to it next week. But anyway, there are several passages where I was like, oh man, like. I've been looking at the Boethius influence, and it was kind of under the surface, and then when he talks about it explicitly, I'm like, oh, there it is. It's right there. Like, oh, this is so good. So anyway, yeah. It's awesome.
Maybe further, just because you've just made that point, I do think it's interesting, this whole thing about providence and also the ideas of free will and predestination. But for people who are listening, Boethius might not be a figure I don't think are familiar with.
Yeah, so Boethius is the guy who wrote the Consolation of Philosophy, which most people don't realize, but the Consolation of Philosophy is like one of the top 5 most influential books in the Western world, basically. I mean, it was probably top 3 most influential Christian works, with counting the Bible as number 1. It's probably number 3 for 1,000 years. I mean, it's like everybody read the Consolation of Philosophy, and I cannot recommend it enough. I think it's an awesome book, and it's particularly interesting, by the way, in that he seems to have undertaken this, and even a lot of modern Christians who have read Boethius will sometimes get a wrong impression about it, because basically he sort of sets out to, is written in prison. So he was in prison. He was in prison and actually was indeed, well, he was in exile, not exactly in prison. He was in exile. He was like on an exile on a Mediterranean island, right? Because he was like 4th century, late Roman Empire stuff. Post-Roman Empire, actually, like under Gothic kings. But anyway, so he's a late Roman, and was in exile. He had like gone into he'd like been framed and like politically destroyed by his enemies and exiled and lost everything, and was feeling understandably sorry for himself in prison. And then he writes this dialogue, which is a dialogue between himself and Lady Philosophy, who is like the allegorical figure representing wisdom. And he is, complaining, like, and essentially his complaint is like, what gives? Like, I've been a good person. I've tried to be a good person, and this is what I get. Like, how does this make sense? How does this work? So he's confronting first and foremost the question of like, why do bad things happen to good people, especially me? And then he gets around to the question of God's foreknowledge and predestination and free will. How can there be free will if God knows what's going to happen and everything? And he gives the best and most satisfying answer to that question that has never been given in Western tradition. The Cliff's Notes version of the answer is, God is not in time. Like, we are not. God is not. Right. God is not in time. And if you think through the implications of God not being restricted in time in the same way that we are, it will really change your perspective about God's foreknowledge. And there is no predestination. There's just destination. Predestination implies that God is in time. He's not in time. He doesn't predestine things. He just destines things. He doesn't foreknow things. He just knows them, because he's seeing all these things all at once, the whole history of the universe spread out before him. Anyway, but Boethius's approach is he doesn't quote the Bible. Like there are a couple places where he tangentially quotes the Bible, sort of paraphrases the Bible, but he doesn't go to it for authority. He basically tries to show how even pagan philosophy itself, like Aristotle and Plato, if you just like work with nothing other than Aristotle and Plato, even there you can still get to these ideas. Like they show you don't have to just accept, it's not just a question. His answer to his, own spiritual dilemma is not merely adhere to the teachings of scripture, right? But even reason itself shows us that, that this makes sense, that this is sound, that this is true. And it's so powerful. But anyway, yeah. So Tolkien in many of his books, but I mean, in The Lord of the Rings especially, I think that Tolkien's literary depiction, like the way that he dramatizes providence is, and the relationship between God's plan and free will, is some of the most theologically subtle treatments of free will and God's foreknowledge and God's plan, God's providence, that we see, that I've seen anywhere. I mean, I don't know anybody who's treated that better. And again, back to the differences between him and Lewis, right? Lewis would talk about it. If it were him, Lewis would talk about it, right? Tolkien doesn't talk about it. You can read The Lord of the Rings 15 times and not really pick up on the idea that he's interested in this and he's thinking about this. And again, that's the difference. Tolkien is willing to let that happen. Like, he doesn't care if you get it or not, right? In a sense, like he's not trying to teach it. He's just embodying it, and there it is, right? But you can see even in The Hobbit, you can see it. In my book on The Hobbit, I talked about this, all the references to Bilbo's luck, right, which get repeated and repeated, like, gosh, isn't he really lucky? And then it comes back around to sort of showing how, and Gandalf in the final page pointing to how these things were not just arranged for his benefit. This was not just luck, right? There was a larger story being told. He has played a part in this large story, but luck is not a talent that he has. It's not about him in the end. He has been a part of a bigger story, and he's played an important part in that. The role of free will. So like the kind of glimpse that, like, yeah, there was a bigger plan going on, and that the actions that you took along the way were part of that big plan, it turns out, is what we see in The Hobbit. In The Lord of the Rings, we get a much stronger emphasis on free will itself, and the choices that you make. And so this is where, again, I got in the Nature of Middle-earth. He's not talking about The Lord of the Rings explicitly. He's talking about elves and elvish free will, but he talks about it explicitly, the ways in which these two things go together and the ways in which these things are brought together. And Comedy's practically paraphrasing book 5 of Boethius. It's like he doesn't use the same illustration, but it's everything but this. He doesn't actually talk about like the treasure buried in the field from book 5 of Boethius, but it's like everything except that specifically. Instead, he uses a Lord of the Rings illustration. He talks about the chance meeting between Gandalf and Thorin instead, but it's exactly the same principle that he's explaining. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the it's definitely a book that influenced Tolkien a lot. But yeah, he was Tolkien was I mean, he was a Catholic, and he was strongly influenced by, a lot of, very much traditional Catholic theology, especially Aquinas. Is manifested, and Augustine too. I mentioned briefly the theological dilemma that the orcs became, right? And the kind of the horns of the dilemma that Tolkien was caught on is, on the one hand, he loved the idea of this externalized evil, right? The enemy, that it's a joy and a liberation to fight and even to kill, right? You don't have to worry about, as you did with humans, right? As we see with Sam and the Southron warrior and so they're people, right? Who might have been deceived, might not be evil at heart, right? Orcs, not so, right? Don't have that problem with orcs. And yet, so that's one thing. But on the other hand, after the Lord of the Rings is when he really kind of sits down and theologically starts thinking through things. You might think, little late now, but anyway, he did. And when he does, and you can see this came to him in the middle of writing Lord of the Rings. He was like, okay, evil cannot create, evil can only corrupt. Like that's a really important, like Augustinian theological
evil as
principle.
negation is big. Yeah,
exactly. And so he's like, because in his original, like you can read it back in the mythology he wrote in the 30s, the origin of orcs, like the old origin of orcs, which was still kind of existing in his mind. Like that was still the backstory of orcs when he began writing the Lord of the Rings, was that they were constructs. Like Morgoth made them out of like slime and blood, and he poured his own hatred into them, and they were like automatons of evil, basically, is what orcs were. They were not creatures at all. They were constructs, right? And then he's like, Tolkien realized, like, no, they can't be that. They can't be that. They do have independent action. And evil can't make new creatures. So
evil cannot create.
Yeah. And honestly, I think that when there's a scene in The Two Towers when one of the coolest scenes in the whole book, when Frodo and Sam are on the stairs of Cirith and end up having both a theological discussion and a literary discussion. It's amazing. That's the don't the old stories ever end conversation between Frodo and Sam. But Sam is also asking about the orcs. They're talking about their supplies, and Sam's a little worried about their supplies, and he's talking about Mordor across the mountains. They're climbing up the mountains, and he's worrying about the other side. And he says, well, there must be food and drink there that we might be able to get, right, if we don't have enough, right? He's like, or don't orcs eat and drink, or do they just live on foul air and poison, right? And Frodo answers him and says, no, they eat and drink. Evil does not have the power to create real new creatures of its own. And I'm convinced when Frodo said that, that's when Tolkien was like, well, shoot. Like, I mean, this happened in Tolkien a lot. Like his characters would say something and he's like, well, now what am I going to do? Right. So like that's the moment when like that theology became clear, and he never backed down from it. Like that became the thing. And so he tried to square, but he didn't want to give up the other side. Like he didn't want to just put orcs into the human camp where they were like people you might need to have pity on, and they might, can they be redeemed? Like, should we be trying to convert the orcs instead of just killing them? Right. He didn't want to go there, like, because that kind of externalized presence of evil, that representation within the story, and the multiple ways in which it's so applicable, right, to read this story where you're fighting against evil in the ways that they do, right, against the orcs, against the Balrog. That was so powerful, and he loved that, and he saw the power of that, and he didn't want to lose that. He didn't want to just make orcs yet another essentially sort of subspecies of humans, like another group of people that you have to separate the sin and the sinner with, right? He didn't want to have to go there, but he tried to find a way around it. It was really hard. It was really complicated, and he never solved it. But
amazing. I want to be respectful of your time. We have been chatting here for over an hour, but this has been just a phenomenal talk. I hope that maybe in the future you will come back and we can question you again about some other themes that appear in Tolkien. Sure. But that was an excellent exposition just of what mythology was in Tolkien and some of the relational things between him and Lewis. So, Professor Olsen, I just want to thank you so much for coming on today. I appreciated it so much. It was so interesting.
No problem. Thank you for having me. I'd be happy to come back. It's always a pleasure. There's a sense in which, as I say, I'm always trying to be mindful in my own broadcasts. We have a very varied audience, and I have loved the conversations I've had with people, many of whom are non-Christian or even anti-Christian, who are Tolkien fans and who have enjoyed the podcast and been part of our community. And I really value that, and I don't want to lose that. So I always try to be careful, as we talked about at the beginning, I'm not going to, back down about the stuff that's there, and we're going to bring out the stuff that's there, and I'm not going to be afraid to talk about it. But I do try to be, I just to not kind of beat the Christian drum really hard during my broadcast. So talking with you guys and your audience is, is kind of like, I don't know, talking out of school. Like it's really fun. Yeah. It's really fun to get to talk in a Christian context about some of the stuff that I just, I don't get as much of a chance to talk about in my normal broadcast so much. So it's a great pleasure is what I'm saying to speak with you guys.
Really glad that you had that opportunity. And like I said, we'll have to get you back then so that we can talk about more of the Christian themes that appear in Tolkien.